Welcome back to the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. For those newly joining the program, my name is Irina Zuckerman, and I am the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. With us today is Misshi Oreshnikov. He's the secretary of the Diplomatic Council of Chuvassia and Volga, Bulgaria, and he's also the press secretary of the National Renaissance Assembly.
Hello, everyone.
Today's discussion will focus on the National Renaissance Assembly and the bringing together of the different ethnic opposition groups in Russia and their vision for the future of their work, the future of their rights activism, and potentially even the future after Russia in its current form, with its current leadership, will no longer be an issue. Misha, thank you for joining us today. Before we get into this complicated discussion, with which many of our listeners are probably not very familiar with, could you tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, where you're from, and what is your cultural background, and how you got involved in this form of activism?
Okay. I was born and grew up in Cheboksary, and part of my childhood I spent in the village of Shorshali, where the third Soviet cosmonaut Nikolaev was born. And from early childhood, I was faced with misunderstanding why people around me are so strange, weird, aggressive, toxic. Instead of giving pushback to the aggressor, they were looking for someone weaker in order to take revenge on. Usually that's about weaker people. So I was looking for various form of protest to protest the system that has built up in Russia. I wanted the society to be safe and secure. And at a certain moment, I came to the conclusion that at age of 20, I got into the police office after one of the protest events. So I was sent into prison, and after getting back from prison, I decided to become involved into serious political activity and to become in opposition to the Russian government. When in 2014, the Russian government attacked Ukraine, as a supporter of freedom, I supported Ukraine. And because of that, I received a certain set of repressions from the Russian government. When I left Russia just before the court hearing and applied for asylum in Ukraine, Russia even appealed to Interpol, and there was a case when they detained me in Indonesia a couple of years ago that was a really public case. And after this, the Russian government interfered. As a result, I was deported to Ukraine, and Interpol gave me the immunity from the Russian requests because Russia is using Interpol for political repressions by the Russian government. And after Russia started the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, I understood that Russia is the player that will never stop until someone stops it. And any weakness that, not the weakness, but any tolerance feature is perceived as weakness, that Russia should hit with aggression. And it leads to the fact that Russia continues to attack weak states, to harass a population in its own country. And as a result, there is an understanding that I'm in the midst of that events of the country that attacked another sovereign country. And it was high time for me to act and to use my knowledge, skills, talents in order to stop the Russian terrorist state. As a result, as I am from Chuvasha, and I have many acquaintances, friends who support the ideas of freedom. We created the movement of Free Volga Bulgaria. And with my fellow thinkers, we created the Diplomatic Council of Volga Bulgaria that united their people from various walks of life and various organizations related to Chuvasha. All of us are based on the idea that Russia is a terrorist state. And for us, it is an occupier because our people became part of Russia, not on a voluntary basis, but through the Russian pressure, through the Russian aggression. And there was not a single opportunity to leave Russia, to succeed from Russia, because we never had this legal opportunity. No one even asked us whether we want to become part of Russia or whether we want to leave Russia. That is why, by seeing that we have experiencing this historic moment when Russia is liquidating free countries of Europe, or it will be liquidated and reformed into a multiple free states, as it happened, for example, in Latin America or in European Union, when European empires broke up and it gave freedom to its people, like after Roman Empire, Third Reich, and other empires that took freedoms away from people living over there. Unfortunately, unlike European peoples, unlike the Western peoples, we don't have this opportunity. And our task is to fight for that, to fight for this opportunity. Thus, in a way that can be adequate to the situation.
So clearly, you're on a quest for self-determination. Now, recently, Putin, in his interview with Tucker Carlson, went into a half-hour discourse talking about the history of Russia and Ukraine, or rather his fantasies about that history. Not much of what he said had any bearing on actual chain of events. I don't want to repeat the same question, the same situation, and delve too much into long historic discussions, but I do want to give our listeners an opportunity to learn a little bit more about Chuvasha and Volga Bulgaria. What are they? Where are they? What are they culturally, and how did they come to be part of Russia?
Okay, there were Huns and Attila, the leader of Huns. He invaded Europe, and he was the leader of the great migration of people that put the end to the Roman Empire and led to the beginning of creation of new European states that became the modern European states later on. So he had a son who became the head of the oriental part of empire that was on the territory of modern Ukraine, Carpathian Mountains, and Caucasus and Kuban. After the death of Irnaka, his son, his country was inherited by two of his sons. And as a result of that inter-clan clashes, Avars came in and joined the fight. And after they lost the fight, Han Kubrat, who was based on the territory of the modern Ukraine, became the head of all Han's tribes, united all of them into one people, Bulgar people, and founded the state Greater Bulgaria that existed on the territory of modern Ukraine for some time. But when Khazars came, the sons of Han Kubrat decided to split the state into three parts and took its people into three different directions. And one of the sons took Bulgars to the Balkans, where he founded Bulgaria. The modern name Bulgaria, it comes from that. Although they took the Slavic language, and only the name Bulgaria was kept as a remnant of that great Bulgaria. And one of them ministers from Bulgaria gave a gift to President Zelensky in the form of the sword of Han Kubrat. Another went to Caucasus and founded Black Bulgaria. And after certain clashes, wars, the local population became dispersed among Nogai and Balkar. The third part went to Volga, where they founded Volga, Bulgaria. Well, the historians call it Volga, Bulgaria. They themselves call it Nukhrad, Bulgaria, which is Silver, Bulgaria. And as a result of invasion of Mongols, the state was destroyed. The administrative occupational zone, Ulus Juchi, was founded, or in other words, it was a Golden Horde. The occupational power was in charge of all the affairs with completely different culture, language. There were Kipchaks from Central Asia, where they came with their army, with their administration. They liquidated the local elite and started assimilating the local city population. They adopted Islam, started using Kipchak languages. Later on, they became known as Kazan Tatars. But the rural population, they still kept their Bulgar language. They did not convert into Islam, and they were pagans. Pagan in the old Tatar language sounds Chuvash. That's how the name Chuvash appeared. So it means the rural population who preferred not to adopt Islam, not to assimilate into the urban population. Still, Chuvash population kept its own ancient language. They even kept some runes, pre-writing system elements, and all the holidays are kept. So this culture and language is still alive, but the politics of the Russian government is really repressive and genocidal, and everything is being done in order to take our people from the face of the earth. When I was little, I would go to the village to my grandmother, and there was the whole generations of people who didn't speak Russian, who spoke only Chuvash. There was TV programs, mass media, press, only in Chuvash. After 30 years of the Putin politics, the new generation does not speak Chuvash. There is no single school that would teach Chuvash. And Chuvash language became elective, not compulsory in the school education. In a couple of years, they would cancel Chuvasha. They would claim that all of you are Russians. I would say that it's next near past. Russia is doing everything possible in order to eliminate all the ethnic minorities. So you can see the so-called Russians with the so-called different background. It can be seen from their face. You can see that their background is completely different from different continents. So people from different backgrounds, but due to genocidal practices, they force them to forget about their origin, about their background. Our task is to keep our identity, to keep our language, to use our language, and in order to develop our culture, because it is rich, interesting. If the Western representatives knew about it, the Western representatives wouldn't pay that much attention to the Russian culture, because the Chuvash culture is richer, because it is more ancient than the Russian culture.
So, what is Russia's, or specifically Putin and current Kremlin's interest in erasing this culture instead of adapting it and using it as a form of cultural diplomacy to attract broader international support? Why would they go in this direction of suppressing these voices instead of using that ethnic diversity in its borders as a form of strength?
Putin is a selfish guy, and if he sees that the West is supporting some diversity, he can always tell them about the cultural diversity. But in fact, everything is being banned. The total repression is going on the language and culture activists that try to support the local cultures and languages. It is being done in order to facilitate the government management system. People should be made the same without any differences, not diverse. You can take a look at the Third Reich, the North Korea, Soviet Union, where people were assimilated into one pattern, into one identity, into one religion, into one identity. The more commonness there is among the people inhabiting this particular territory, they become easier to manage, like slaves, and they would have less of personalities, individualities in them, because any rebellion is being caused not by slaves, but by the individuals who have their own identities.
So this systematic erosion of cultures, it's very typical of conformist authoritarian regimes. We're hearing the same about different diverse ethnicities in Iran, in China. They're suffering the same fate, and of course, the Soviet Union, as you pointed out, created assimilationist policies and also was engaged in a practice of ethnic displacement and to facilitate this sort of integration. Has there been this sort of ethnic displacement policy in that region as well?
Well, we had the following colonial policy. At first, it was about the ban to live in cities and to use metals, because without metals you cannot make firearms or cold arms. And in urban areas, it was difficult from the assimilation point of view. Furthermore, when the colonization period started, when different people started moving to areas of Volga, Bulgaria. For example, Russians were moving, Ukrainians moving, Cossacks, even Germans, Volga Deutsche, started populating the territory of then Volga, Bulgaria, but not pinpointedly, but like in lines.
Hmm.
So there would be the whole line of villages or settlements, so that the uniqueness of Chuvash could be separated into separate groups. So that's the policy of cultural isolation, so that the settlements couldn't be connected to each other. They would be adjacent to settlements of other ethnic groups like Russians and so on. The Soviet Union continued this practice and increased it, strengthened it by Holodomor or famine. It happened in Ukraine and in Chuvash as well, because Chuvash were mainly rural population. Urban population was mainly Russian and other ethnic minorities, not in Chuvash, that were allowed to settle in urban centers. So taking away the food from rural areas led to the mass famine, or to eat their dead children. My grandmother was telling me stories. At the same time, activists were shot by the Soviet government just for concealing small heaps of grain that they wanted to leave behind to feed their children. So they were given harsh prison sentences for that. So people were placed in these horrible life conditions that very small percentage of Chuvash survived. But the modern occupational politics preferred to forget about it. That's just a famine and government has nothing to deal with it. They try not to raise the issues of forceful taking away of food or mass shootings of activists. So the people, the Volga Bulgaria, who was equal to Kievan Rus and who even fought on equal basis with Kievan Rus, became a small ethnic group, 1.5 million right now. And as a result of this genocidal politics, right now there is a new leap of genocidal politics, the cultural substitution. Everything is being done for the Chuvash and other peoples to feel shame, to feel a second class identity. So if we have a group with the majority of Chuvash and some Russian, most of the Chuvash would feel ashamed to speak Chuvash in public, because the result of occupational politics, they have the opinion that to be Chuvash is something to be ashamed of.
Now, back in the Soviet Union, they had government officials who were responsible for particular regional policies, for ethnic policies, for various autonomous republics and so forth. Is it after the breakup of the Soviet Union? Did this policy continue? Is there anyone in particular who is in charged with implementing this cultural genocide and this attempt to erase Chuvash identity?
There are agencies. The most horrible thing is the narrative base, which is working. It is trying to persuade the Chuvash officials themselves to participate in this genocidal policy. For example, the head of the Chuvash Republic, he was the author of the law to cancel the education in Chuvash language as part of the national language cancellation. So he supported the cancellation of local language education across the whole Russia. So the representative of Chuvash nation is a part of the genocidal policy. He was not elected by Chuvash people. He was appointed by Putin. At that, when Chuvash had a direct vote of the head of the republic, when Yeltsin invaded Chechen Republic, the Chuvash delegation was sent to Chechnya to negotiate with the head of Chechnya, Dudaev, when they were discussing the opportunity to forbid to use Chuvash soldiers in Chechnya, because the Chuvash, at least on the government level, were not supportive of the Yeltsin policy. But Yeltsin, by using his dictatorship policies, abolished the decisions of the Chuvash government. Well, the last head of Chuvashia, Ignatiev, even took Putin's decree to court, because when Putin dismissed him, Ignatiev even challenged it in court. But later on he died, and officially he died from COVID. And after that things, Putin is appointing the head of Chuvashia directly, and this already representative of Putin is a conductor of the genocidal policy. The head of Chuvashia is also connected to the genocidal policy of transfer of Ukrainian children from Ukraine and placing them in Russia, and he is an accomplice to other war crimes that should be prosecuted by the Hague court. I wouldn't go case by case, but at least I wanted to give you a heads up that can be found publicly. I would say that that's a horrible person, government official. So if some people think that he's just an innocent implementer of the Putin's orders, they're mistaken.
Some of these people have been placed under US sanctions for participation in the forcible transfers of the Ukrainian population, including children, into Russia. But I don't know if there's been any sort of reaction from any officials in the West to these policies, primarily because no one is particularly aware of them. What effort, in the aftermath of the Soviet Union and before Putin came in that brief period, was there any effort to bring the culture and the history of the Chuvash people to more of the international sphere and education?
Back then, the Chuvash National Congress became part of the UN mandated Congress of unrepresented nations. I don't remember the exact name. And the Chuvash National Congress was part of this body. But under Putin, it stopped its participation. Then there were Chuvash TV channels, lots of mass media, print media. In fact, Chuvash culture could represent itself in various spheres of life in Chuvashia. There were even laws that people couldn't get employment without the knowledge of Chuvash. The education in most of the rural schools was conducted in Chuvash, and Russian was only conducted starting from, I think, second grade already as a foreign language. So everything was, the tendency was that Chuvash would maintain their cultural identity. The Chuvash constitution was adopted, and later on it was violated by Moscow unilaterally. The Chuvash people had a right to have their own budget, their own funding, their own their own hard currency funding to elect their own local government that they cannot do right now. There was a wide autonomy on the level of the Soviet Republic, at least according to the document. But after that, Moscow abolished that, and we're planning at a better day, to abolish this Moscow imposed law, because it was imposed unilaterally by Moscow, and it is not a part of a functioning document from the point of view of the law, and we need just to state that. And if we take away this law, then it would mean that there would be a total sovereignty from Moscow that was stated already by the Chuvash government in 1990s. But Moscow, once again, I would like to reiterate, abolished it because it is engaged in the dictatorship colonial policy.
So my understanding is, based on everything you said, that the current Chuvash authorities are state-appointed, Kremlin-appointed, and therefore have no wider internal legitimacy. Has there been any efforts to pressure these individuals into resigning or simply boycotting their illegitimate practices and rules?
There are no opportunities for the feedback for the population to exercise its power. But we shouldn't be a psychologist. If the person is detached from reality, from real life, then they're making inadequate things, for example, rape women, kill innocent people, to harass children, just because they have problems, mental problems. They see enemies in those people who are not enemies, and to express aggression towards them, because Putin is already in power for more than 30 years. And everything is being done in the Russian government for him to be isolated from the feedback. So, as US journalist Tucker noted after the interview, that he is not connected to reality. So, we're dealing with a really lunatic who needs to be sent to the mental institution. But instead, he has the nuclear arsenal under his hand, all the political instruments, the seat in the UN Security Council, permanent seat, that he will never leave, because they're afraid, or they don't want to face off this reality. That's a mystery for me. The funniest thing for me is that the political world is perceiving this person, Putin, as someone who can be talked to, instead of putting him in a mental institution.
My understanding is also that the recent policies include disproportionate recruitment of various non-Russian ethnic groups into the military, and particularly towards the invasion of Ukraine. Has Chuvassia been also affected by this mobilization policy?
Yes, in November, the order was issued that 15,000 subpoenas were printed to enlist 15,000 people, and Chuvassia promised to fulfill this order by April, and it seems that they're almost ready to implement it. 15,000 males, that's like 1% of the population. That means there would be just grind meat in Ukraine, so they will be dead.
What happens if that quota is not fulfilled and all these people massively refuse to go?
First of all, they are not even asked what they want. They are forced to do it. no matter what they feel concerning the leadership that is implementing this policy. If this leadership does not implement this quota, then someone high in the top will do it. And someone in the military hierarchy is telling that if the leadership does not do it, then them themselves would be sent to fight in Ukraine.
So that brings me to activism and to movement. And you mentioned that from a very young age, seeing all these practices, you were appalled and you were trying to resist. But we have seen in recent years crackdowns on activism that even worse than what happened before 2014. Has there been any uh what kind of repressions have Chuvash rights activists faced in the last 10 years or so?
So your mistake is that it hadn't taken place. It has been taking place for the third years. For example, the famous Russian journalist Listyev was assassinated in 1995. Many other government officials were harassed. So Kremlin started using more harsh measures. For example, Novichok, nerve agent. For example, there was an investigation in the West of the investigation of the assassination of high-level officials with this nerve agent. One of my friend was tortured in the Russian prison. He was given some nerve agent shots, and his nails were taken out. And later on, they wrote that he committed a suicide by cutting his throat and hanging himself at the same time. So it is happening in Russia all the time. I was in the Russian prison in 2010. I saw how terrible it is. The problem is that many counterparts prefer not to notice it. To see these horrible things is like during the Third Reich. Everyone understood what is happening inside the Third Reich, but they were trying to make an impression that it was too horrible to believe that it was happening. What is happening right now in Russia, Iran, Russia, and other anti-humane regimes is just like what was happening in the Third Reich. And the West is behaving in the same appeasement policy like back then. It is not happening. Please prove. So Navalny had to die, quite a famous in the West political activist, so that it would be noticed. But it has been happening for the last 30 years with everyone. The catastrophe is that the West, for all those 30 years, is giving money to the Russian opposition. Go and protest peacefully, pay the taxes, pay the fines, support the Russian government, and for that they will kill you. And it is death conveyor is continuing. So these protests are continuing. They're being thrown into prison, then they're killed in prisons. It is nothing but just a total suicide. If we're dealing with a state terrorism just because they want to do it, it can be only liquidated. No protest, peaceful events can help. I really love Gandhi, and I love his nonviolent protest theory. And I call for all Russian citizens to follow this principle. If you can provide your own security. If you cannot provide your own security, I consider that you should act in a different way with Russia adequately. All terrorists and bandits should be neutralized that are responsible for the murder of innocent people. Otherwise, you cannot stop this system. There are legal practices. According to the law, legal practices, if the criminal is not stopped, the criminal continues to commit crimes until this person is stopped.
So speaking of the Russian opposition, there's been a number of well-known Russian opposition members, political candidates, journalists, human rights defenders, and so forth, who've been arrested, assassinated, or otherwise persecuted over the years. But most of them, you never hear most of them have not really talked about the issues of these ethnic repressions, ethnic and cultural identity-based repressions. Has there been any formal dialogue with any of these official or better known or West supported opposition groups or individuals? And if not, can you explain why? What is the dynamic?
Well, you need to understand some things about Russia. Russia is sick from the Soviet times with racism. Well, the ideology of the Soviet Union was they're against racism, but at the same time they were discriminating all other ethnic people on ethnic basis. Russia is just an heir to the Soviet policy, and it creates a painful stigmatization for the so-called liberal opposition because they follow the same example and they use the same idea of anti-racism in the same way. By calling themselves anti-racism, they behave as racisms. They ignore the issues of ethnic minorities in Russia, but at the same time they're claiming to be against racism, but they're only interested only in the issues from Muscovites. For example, have you seen a protest event in Moscow because of the ethnic issues in Chuvassia, Sakha, and other ethnic republics? Have you seen any protest events in Moscow? Protest events in ethnic regions because there is an issue in Moscow. Have you heard about the cargo cult? Well, in Indonesia, when they took a look how Americans are using airplanes, so they wanted to build wooden planes. So Russian opposition is looking at the Americans in the same way. They think that they're Americans, but at the same time, they keep their racism views that the Kremlin is so trying to so hard to keep. I had to go through these stages. I saw these stages in myself, but I recovered from that. But the Russian opposition is still sick with it. So take a look at the Congress organized by Ponomarev. They claim to be anti-colonial, but how many representatives are there from Moscow political elite? The majority. How many represent regional politics? A majority. How many of them are representing ethnic minorities? Zero in this Ponomarev Congress. Some of them represent, but they don't have any say in the decision-making process. So speaking about decolonial policy, we should state that decolonial should not be fake, but real, because what is being implemented right now by the Russian opposition is a fake. That's the huge issue and challenge for the Russian opposition and to what is happening now. And as a result, all ethnic minorities are under pressure right now, in the same way as Ukrainians, they feel the pressure of this colonial policy.
So tell me about your movement and how you're bringing all these ethnic groups together, and what is their version, and how would the process, what are they hoping to achieve, and in what manner, and also how is their vision different from the so-called decolonization policies of the Russian opposition?
So we're interested in the real decolonization. We're all representing countries that were destroyed and occupied by Russia. Prior to the Russian occupation, each of our countries had its own borders that are different from that reservations in the form of ethnic republics that Russia gave us. And not all ethnic groups have these national borders. And we would like to change the Russian map to in a way that it was before the Russian had occupied our countries. As we had wars between our groups, ethnic groups, we could have some territorial disputes among us. But as we're smart and reasonable people from the very beginning, we signed an agreement among each other that all territorial conflicts would be resolved by means of negotiation or in a court manner. If we cannot reach agreement in a negotiation process, we can take this case to court, but not in a military violent way. We have enough of violence coming from the Kremlin. We don't want to continue this violent path. But we have these representatives of these people, people living in North Caucasus, in Slavic people, Turkic people, because Russian are not the only Slavic people living in Russia, unlike the Russian propaganda is telling us. And we're all united around one simple argument. We don't want to conquer other people. We want freedom from whoever is already conquering us. We cannot have any conflicts among each other. We want just freedom. And so we don't need to fight among each other for power. That's why it's not difficult for us to unite. What is surprising for me, and I don't see it in the Russian liberal opposition, why cannot they unite? There are so many factions. At the same time, they're claiming to share the same values, but they don't have any desire to cooperate and unite, just because each one of these factions want to be the leader in this group. But we're uniting people who are interested in just freedom. And we're honest about it. For us, it is important to be sincere. For us, for our partners, for our population, for our audience, because the Russian government policy is already stuck in lies. And that's why the local ethnic groups don't respect any of them Russian leaders as legitimate, because they're already mired in lies. We're the supporters of the policy of transparency, of honesty, sincerity. That's how we broadcast it to our audience, so that our audience can see the difference between us and the traditional Russian politics. So we are based on adequacy, so that on the principle that the dialogue should be led with each region in their own language. If we deal with a terrorist state that can only resort to terrorist narrative, we don't see any other option but to help Ukraine in conducting its counter-terrorist operation against the terrorist state in a way that we can support Ukraine. It is important when we deal with Ukraine, we deal with European security and the security for the whole world.
You've discussed how Russia has penetrated these ethnic regions in a way that killed, that made people ashamed of their own identity and afraid of expressing any public support for these causes. So how does your movement ensure that it actually has real followers and not just symbolic, activists in charge of the process? How do they ensure that they have legitimacy with the constituencies they claim to represent?
So that's the issue that is related to sincerity. The more sincere you are with the audience, the more people see how sincere you are, that your words are linked to your actions, and it ignites them. And after that, they become inspired by this sincerity, and they start spreading this idea around themselves in a snowball effect. In the same way, fear is being spread across people. When people are pressured and they are fearful, and they translate this fear among their peers. So the first thing that we need to do is inspire others with our own examples, and that we give an opportunity and resources to other people to follow our own example. For me, it is important to be not just the leaders for others, but the ones who can give best case scenarios, best examples, and can teach other people how to protect themselves, how to defend themselves from the terrorist state, how to gain security and safety, how to deprive the terrorist state of inflicting damage to others.
So tell us a little bit more detail about the structure of the movement. Who are the members, and how is the decision-making process made? How what resources it has and how it's moving forward with its agenda.
Okay, we don't use neither democratic nor dictatorship principles. We use libertarian principles. Every movement is free to build their own agenda, their own decisions. But we're coordinating and communicating among each other. We discuss certain ideas, commenting, criticize as being reasonable and flexible in our mentality. We see some agenda items that have to be on the agenda for everyone. Sometimes our agenda items differ. Some organizations can keep to some agenda, and some movements can take in 2 or 3 agenda items. So in this way, we keep the unity that helps each other, help its members, taking into account that some of its members have their own agenda. So by using the coordination and communication, we do not obstruct others in pursuing their own agenda items. No matter what decisions we're making, we still keep to the main objective that we strive to reach success, and no matter how different our agenda items are, what we manage to achieve, it comes to success.
Now, let's talk about the viability of the movement. Let's say, for the sake of argument, that these representatives succeed in mobilizing sufficient majorities of the populations to actually create a very visible movement. Let's say that somehow along with other resources they manage to displace the current Kremlin approach. What is the path to self-governance? What natural economic and political resources would these small states have, given that their population has been decimated by repression and also territorially mismanaged in a way that there's a lot of dispersion. What's the practical governance vision?
The majority of the representatives in our movement are supporters of libertarianism, of the minimum involvement of the government in the economic life of the country. That's the opposite of what is happening in the Russian state right now, when for many decades the Russian population was not used to freedom. Whenever you are faced with people that have never been engaged to freedoms, that someone was making decisions for them. So these people have to go through a set of mistakes. So this anarchy or libertarianism is a pathway to that, so that the people through mistakes can learn how to use this freedom, how to make decisions, in order not to lose that economic chains that were built within the Russian state. We're inclined to sign mutual bilateral treaties on economic trade, as it is happening within the EU. There are several economic blocks, for example, bridge, most, where Chuvassia, Bashkortostan, Mariel, Mordov representatives, Cossacks from Urals, from Kuban, from Don, and Finno-Ugric people of Komi, Udmurt, Karel, and Pomor, they part of this economic bloc. So it would be a huge trade belt that encompasses the middle part of Russia. And that would have the unified customs-free zone that would contribute to the economic development. There are other integrational economic projects that are linked with EU or with Asian macroeconomic projects, for example, Turan or Great Silk Way Road. it will be just up to the choice of the future state, whom it is better to trade with, who our trading partners are. Concerning leaders that we have right now, they're sincere, honest people that are committed to their objective. So I really love working with them in this way. I see future with them. If not the majority of the population is supporting them, but in future, the majority of the people will support them. We'll see that that's the example to follow. But there is not an issue that these movements will not be supported by the majority of Russians. Because Russians were not familiar with democratic instruments, unlike in the West. So they were used to someone making decisions for them, usually who is stronger. And they were used to believing that people, whether that was a friend, opponent, or oppressor, irrespective of the policy. So I can call it a syndrome, maybe you've heard about it. And our task is to treat Russians from the Stockholm syndrome. So for that, we would need to get them rid of this aggressor. We need to show them an example of leaving the Katman triangle, because otherwise it's impossible to build a free society in Russia. If you substitute Putin for another alternative, another Putin, the society that has been raised in a manner when someone else is making decision for them will not be, will be difficult to transfer to the free society that at least Navalny was praising.
What is your plan for gaining international legitimacy, given that most people don't know much about this movement, much less that there is a diversity of thought inside the Russian society? They are only familiar with either the Kremlin perspective or the Navalny type opposition that now has been essentially beheaded.
Well, you know, the West could commit this mistake without the war, and Putin was using the unawareness of the West about the things happening in Russia. And at the same time, he could use the divide and rule policy in order to fiddle with the world. But the Western politicians, right now, they realize the risks associated with Putin, and they start looking for alternative, as Navalny is right now gone. So the West will have to take a deeper look at what is happening on the political sphere in Russia, to look not just what Russian opposition activists are saying that do not represent the whole range of the Russian population. That's when the West will get acquainted with our movement, that will have more perspectives, more chances, because we're the proponents of decolonization, deimperialization, free society, resolution of conflicts in a non-violent way. We're not the heirs to the Soviet nomenclatura that will use the Soviet infrastructure to continue its imperial policy. We usually come from the circles of fighters for freedom. So we are that political foundation that the West has to invest into. If the West wants to get rid of the risks associated with totalitarian countries, if the West does not do it, then the West will have to fight with Russia face to face in the near future. Some Western politicians understand it. Some Western politicians understand that we're investing in these political bubbles that are exploding right now. They're like nonsense. That they were relying on political activists in Russia who do not represent the wishes of the Russian population. It's not to me to explain to the West. It's for the West in order to survive. The West has to look into what is happening in Russia and gain our support, because at this moment our pathways are separate, and Putin will use it in the first turn to destroy the West. Putin has already destroyed us. We have nothing to lose, and he's just on the pathway to destroy the West. So the West has to be concerned, and the West should be looking to establish dialogue with us.
Now, here's a practical question. There is an inherent tension between in the international law between the right to self-determination, which you are currently pursuing, and territorial integrity, meaning the respect for recognized international borders established by the United Nations and voted upon by other member states. Given that Russia is a permanent member of the UN Security Council, and it's you know, the Kremlin is the one who holds the mantle of this representation. How are you going to resolve this issue of political legitimacy, even if you gain sympathy and support from many people, given that Russia does not, want most Russians will not want to renegotiate their borders and to give away any of their territory to any of the claimants. How do you envision gaining that level of support? Or would you be willing to compromise through some sort of a very strong federalist autonomy?
Let us look at one historical aspect. During the great colonies and empires, when we had British Empire that was in possession of the third of the world, there were huge customs duties among countries. It led to the situation that it was beneficial to live in a huge colonial power because your trade barriers were far less. So British were the richest in the world, but in the modern world, the economists of the world understood that the custom duties are hitting at the trade balance. So they need to decrease them in order to facilitate the trade turnover. So they started uniting into trade blocs like EU. And since that, the size of the country started impacting on the fact that the person is living not well but bad. So in a smaller country, you would have a better economic opportunities. You would have a really good feedback with the government. For example, your leader might live just 100 kilometers away from you. If you live in a big country, your leader is living far away. This leader is not going to the same shops, is not walking the same dirty streets. This person is not concerned about the issues that are of concern for the local population. While in smaller countries, it is the vice versa. If we're talking about the confederate policy from the political system of other countries, probably it is more convenient, but it is not convenient for us, the citizens of Russia, in a situation when we have completely different ethnic groups from different cultural, religious backgrounds, language backgrounds, different set of values, or whether on values, for example, on how people should be dressed on the street and so on, or whether they should be dressed at all. As a result, we'll have lots of inter-ethnic conflicts and the fight for domination in this country, for leadership. It can only instigate this conflict, and it will not contribute to the adoption of this tolerance. It will only lead to the more tension. If we want to stop this inter-ethnic conflicts in Russia, and for the people to live peacefully among each other, we need to take away this umbrella upper group. They themselves, they have to make decisions, adopt the rules that they should live with. Then they will not fight with other people because they will not be interested in imposing these rules on other people. Try to imagine a situation. German citizens and Indian citizens and Indonesian citizens and Somali citizens. Try imagine making all four groups to live according to the same rules, with the same budget. So you will see how they will, how much they will hate each other and started fighting among each other. Nobody would want to do it. If we want to stop it, We need to give each ethnic group the right to have their own land, their own country.
Now, one of the big concerns in the West, but particularly among US officials, but also in Europe and among others, is the possibility of chaos if Russia is to break up or if there's a civil war or any sort of, decentralization that's not mutually agreeable, and it's not entirely, a smooth political process like the breakup of Czechoslovakia or something like that. There's a number of officials who are particularly concerned because of the economic interests, because right now US and Europe are trading some of the metals and other natural resources from Russia, and they want to ensure smooth access to that trade. So even after all the sanctions imposed on Russia, after the war in Ukraine and so forth, still a lot of these resources are not currently sanctioned precisely because of this geopolitical economic concern. What would you say to these people?
For example, right now, if the Western business want to buy something in Russia, they need, by means of corruption, bribery, they need to get a green light from the Russian government with the Moscow elite so that they can buy something. And then they will be dependent on the behavior of the Moscow elite. Maybe they will have a bouts of of mental illness due to other sanctions events. So, but if you are buying oil from an independent Siberian state, you do not need to conduct a dialogue with a politician who wants to be the world leader. You are just negotiating with the regional leader who wants to the prosperity for its Siberian Republic. It's far less easier than to negotiate with Moscow, because Siberian states will not have imperial ambitions. They will not try to impact the US policy, and they will not build their economic policy with the West in order to have a toxic impact on the Western politicians. Right now, Moscow is using its trade potential in order to have a toxic impact on the West. If we would have Siberian nations trading, there would be far less trading issues for the West, and the West and the trade will be running smoother. So the West should be interested in having the trade dialogue, not with the Moscow elite, but with small regional elites that do not have any imperial ambitions, that are interested in the trade connections with the West. So the West should be more interested in that. Concerning chaos, chaos has already taken place. Putin is leading a major war conflict in Europe. He is trying to provoke chaos in Europe, in the Baltics. Finland will be next, Moldova, Romania, Turkey, and Greece will face off each other according to the Putin plan. Hamas, as you know, he's pulling the strings in order to instigate the war against Israel. He will do anything in order to instigate chaos in the West, and he will not stop until the West will be plunged into this chaos. The only way to stop this chaos spreading in the West, to eliminate the source of chaos. So yes, in Russia, the chaos will take place, but this chaos in Russia will be temporary, and it is far better to have chaos in Russia than in the West. And this chaos in Russia will not be unmanageable, because all the forces that we want to break up Russia were allies of the West, and we're ready to deal transparently with the West so that it will be manageable by the West. The policy itself, the domestic policy, will not lead to the civil war. Because if the civil war happens, it will be already a consequence of that chaos of what is already happening in Russia, instigated by Putin. That's my thought.
I see a completely legitimate point to all of this, and personally, I I think that it's not in the West's interest to continue supporting huge countries that are using their very size to as leverage against the West and use it to impact and influence other countries around the world, both in violent and also propagandistic way. Unfortunately, their very size gives them current leverage over weapons, over political control, over uh, over support, international support. And there's also the issue of renegotiating various diplomatic deals with multiple future states as opposed to dealing with only one. So it's a issue of convenience and outweighing, the corruption that comes with dealing with one huge state, with dealing with smaller states and possible various economic problems of new young states that are just coming into possession, and the fact, by the way, that whatever remains of Moscow and Russia will probably not start and will try to sway and create destabilization among those smaller states to the best of their ability, and to try to use them as proxies the same way they've used Eastern European countries as satellites during the Cold War. So how can you manage around these issues?
Well, then I wouldn't understand why the West was fighting Hitler. Because Hitler wanted to establish one country in Europe. And then it's the challenge. Why the West was fighting with Hitler? In the same way with Russia. So my example would probably feel would be emotionally incorrect, but that would be true. If for you the ability to deal with one country it is more valuable than the lives of lots of innocent people. So if this issue is being raised, then I would address this issue already to the person who is asking this question, and not to let this person go into politics.
Unfortunately, many of them are already there. They're appointed officials who've been raising concerns not only with respect to Russia but other imperial states in a very similar way. They are not the ones who are suffering the consequences of having to live, under Moscow, Beijing, or Tehran. They live here or in Europe, and they don't have that personal impact. So from their perspective, it is an issue entirely of self-interest and what's convenient to them. So that is an issue that needs to be addressed, because at the end of the day, it's everything will come down to the balance of interest. How do you persuade the other side that overall, even if there are going to be some inconveniences, it's still preferable to take that approach and to support this self-determination versus dealing, with whatever is tried, and used. And by the way, I wouldn't rule out that some of these Western officials are themselves corrupt and they benefit from the status quo, as unfortunate as it may seem. So there is this level of corruption in the West that has precluded effective decision making, even with Ukraine, as we have seen prior to the war, in the 8 years between the invasion of Crimea and then the recent war. The West has not taken particularly strong action to help Ukraine liberate Crimea, when it would have been much easier to do before there was another second invasion. They certainly didn't help Ukraine arm itself sufficiently to deter Russia from reinvading it in the first place. So the question is, how do we resolve these issues given this, and still to this day, there's still inherent hesitation about giving Ukraine all the weapons that it needs to put this war to a very fast conclusion. So given what we're seeing with Ukraine, how can we take the lessons from West's behavior and its approach now, when it's an existential threat, when it threatens to drag NATO into a direct confront war with Russia? How can we use it, uh, and what can we learn from it, and how can these same situations be avoided in the future?
us talk about history. If the US hadn't given the Lend-Lease aid to the Soviet Union, would the Soviet Union win? Where would the American officers meet the Soviet army or German army? Where do you think? Where would it happen? Well,
I mean,
I don't think it's just a rhetorical, hypothetical question.
Mhm.
It's the same hypothetical question. The more corrupt officials in the West support the Russian government, the closer they bring the Russian or Chinese armed forces to their country homes in Maryland or wherever they have their country homes. If you're in a safe country, far away from the zones of conflict, it seems impossible that there would be shooting at your country house. We in Ukraine, we thought that would be impossible for the Russian soldiers to come to Kiev and start shooting. We thought that it's just impossibility, but it happened. Why did it happen? Because nobody stopped the Russian aggressor in time. What happens if the Russian aggressor is not being stopped? Something more terrible would happen. And it will be more difficult to stop this aggressor. The longer it would take us to support Ukraine and countries that oppose Russia, the more difficult it would be to stop the aggressor later on. We have already suffered enough, so we have nothing to lose. But people in the West, they still need to face that challenge that Ukrainians faced. If they don't think long term, if they don't think widely, why these politicians are being appointed in the West, that's probably the issue to the Western people, the Western electorate. Why do you elect these people? Why do you appoint these people, corrupt officials? You would have to face this challenge when Putin soldiers would be marching in America, or Chinese soldiers, because Putin, China, and Iran are trying to coordinate their aggression affairs. They try to ruin international security. They try to ruin NATO. They try to instigate conflicts across the world. They want to deplete Western budgets. When the Western arms will run out, they will start the direct aggression through the various hybrid forms of Luhansk and Donetsk People's Republics, and they will continue until the West stops them. I don't know what else I can say. That's an obvious thing for any long-term politicians who is thinking 20 years ahead. But that's a bad thing for a politician who would think where to spend the bribe that he got from the Russian government official now. Another important issue for the corrupt officials from Russian governments. There is just one Russia. You are taking bribes from one Russia. If you would have 50 countries, there would be 50 bribes. Think well. If you like to take bribes, think well in advance. You can take bribes not just from one country, but from 50 countries.
Well, the good news is, that is definitely an upside if you think about it. And quite frankly, the most important step is the first step to start the process, which, may be difficult given the level of polarization in the West, both in Europe and in the United States. Politically, there's disagreement about everything, both domestic and external policies, and we are seeing the results of it play out in real time, unfortunately. But on the other hand, what you're saying, in countries that have elections, politicians often don't think in long terms. They think in terms of their next election, 2, 4, or 6 years from now, depending on their political position. And that's the problem. That's the problem. Authoritarian regimes, they can afford to think long term. Movements can afford to think long term. But in democracies, politicians only think short term in terms of the elections, and what happens after they're gone from office is not their concern. That's the concern of whoever is next after them. So this is the challenge in convincing them to support policies that in the short term may not bring them benefit, that will benefit the United States, but they may not actually directly benefit from from those positive outcomes because they may no longer be there for that. That's the issue. So the other issue is, of course, messaging. How do you connect with decision makers around the world when the Russian propaganda machinery dominates the space, even affects Western media? You could see the Russian talking points commonly being adopted by American European journalists. So how can you make the messaging powerful enough to overcome this dominance by by your adversaries?
Well, we just need to understand that in Russia is involved in propaganda, in lies. Everything they say is aimed at manipulation, and we should see pure manipulation. That every journalist has to understand it. Or any journalist who is faced with journalism in Russia. So right now, it is not clear to me why Western journalists and politicians take on that points from the Russian messaging. Maybe they're corrupt. Maybe it's beneficial for them, for their short-term benefits. So we need to show that these people are selfish. They want only to support Russia, while Russia at the same time is preparing missiles in order to destroy the West. We remember how many times Russia was saying that Russia will not attack Ukraine. I don't know. There are so many cases in history that happened, and we shouldn't repeat these mistakes. It's just strange to repeat them. If it is happening in the West like this, there is a problem either with the feedback between the population and their leadership. That was probably the only. And I have an idea, a response for that. The democratic world was being established prior to the digital age, when you had to use paper ballots and to gather people in one polling station. It is technically it's quite difficult in order to make decisions. That is why elections are being held once 4 years, 5 years, and so on. In the modern world, where you have the digital device, where you have the internet, you have servers, we, as the Chuvash Independence team, we invented the online account with online democracy, with a high level of feedback between the government, between the politician and the citizen. Whenever the politician is taking a vote contrary to the wishes of the population, so every citizen have the right to push through the app to take their vote from this politician to another politician. If this politician is making decisions contrary to the values, to the wishes of this electorate. So that's the high level of feedback on the political decision-making process. But as in the West, countries are used to be based on the old traditional model, and they have to face with problems that are usually that very unusual to the traditional system, pre-digital age system. So formally, like the US Congress is a remnant of the old vote. Whenever the US citizens couldn't vote online. Right now, when you can take a vote online, and when you see challenges across the world, politicians cannot handle them because they're being elected according to the old traditional manner, not in the digital way manner. So I think that's the main problem. One more issue that I would like to draw your attention to. If we're talking about the digital age, about the politicians not thinking about the future, there is Elon Musk, chips in the West. So Western politicians and business people that can sell these chips to China, and there is China that is interested in using these chips in order to create the digital surveillance and to control the behavior of the people. For example, that is interested even in having dopamine being produced by the human brain in order to love the Chinese Communist Party. So in this way, it is a way to create zombies across the world with chips that would follow the orders of one lunatic. I would like for the West to pay attention to this interesting detail. I'm a software developer. That's why I understand this risk. Whether the Western politicians who are not software developers, they see these risks, I doubt. But I would like for them to pay attention to that and to think seriously what they do and in what world their children will be living in after these decisions are made.
Well, the battle over privacy and versus and digital surveillance, this is indeed a center of very active discussions in the West, and I think most people are very far from buying into speculative projects that have no proven benefit and very high level of risk, as you've just described. Still, bringing your story to the public, circumventing corrupt politicians and getting directly to the voters and explaining to them the sort of information that NGOs that are being paid to disseminate propaganda are not getting to them, that's going to be a significant challenge. It's a challenge of resources, it's a challenge of understanding your audience, and it's a challenge of simply having enough spokespeople and material and disseminating your messaging effectively. What is next in your movement's objective to kind of build up this level of support and to show that you're efficient and that you can be that you can actually build something real? And how do you reach people with that message?
Yes, we have the set of instruments for that toolkit, where smart people and we understand about propaganda, mass psychology, and we have our own section that is being involved in the way to stop Kremlin propaganda. Some of them are not environmental, because whenever you need to disclose this lie, a huge amount of lie, you need to radicalize the process. But sometimes it does not lead to physical injuries, but it leads to moral injuries, because they have to leave that paradigm they've been living in, and they have to take a different look. They're no longer living in this fairy tale that the propaganda was telling them. That's if we're talking about the Russian audience. But we're moving in that direction, and we have primarily we're dealing with adventurists that are ready to fight for our freedom and so on. That was our primary audience, that we're in close communication. I would say that the most radical part of the Russian audience are communicating with us, the radical that have radical attitudes towards the Russian government. But it's time right now to work with the Russian opposition that lost its leaders and lost its adequate strategy. They didn't have adequate strategy. They had inadequate strategy, non-working strategy. They saw that all of their strategies are inefficient and they're lost and they don't know how to behave. Some of them find us and they start working with us, and more of them will be coming to us. Whenever we show them the positive examples of our activity that give best case scenarios, their support will grow. We have really good, adequate, efficient people in our team.
So essentially,
just a second. I will need to leave in 5 minutes.
Yes. I'm just concluding
Okay.
The last question. So basically, your plan is to first focus on your near surroundings on the Russian opposition and other Russians in the nearby, and from there build up enough of a movement that it will then catch attention in the West, and then will self-propagate this information and messaging by virtue of just being larger and having the access to the channels of communication, correct?
In order for our movement to win, it doesn't have to grow big, because the war is going on right now. So there is no politics happening on the territory of Russia, and the instruments that have to be used are adequate to that. But I'm the supporter of minimizing any risks, even among terrorists, because the court has to make decisions. But there are cases when it is impossible to act otherwise, because otherwise people are killing from terrorists, and terrorists have to be stopped. For me, that's the limit. That's the red line where violence can be applied or violence cannot be applied. If the violence helps to support, to stop innocent victims, then violence should be applied. In this situation, it is one of our strategies. And we have units that are fighting in Ukraine that represent certain ethnic minorities, Karel, Chuvash, one guy is over there, Cossacks and so on, that are fighting for Ukraine, hoping to liberate their territories. But that's the factor that's taking away attention of the Russian government. There is an internal factor that we're based on, is the subversive activity or guerrilla warfare that are conducting Ukraine support events or events aimed at terminating the ability of terrorists to conduct their activity. We use various organizations that appear themselves, or they join us, and they join our agenda. We prohibit them to conduct any activities that can harm innocent people, and we provide them with basic training and resources so that their activity would be more efficient and safe. We started it just recently, and in Russia the civil war will start soon, I would say, because the Russian government does not leave any other choice. Without the civil war will not start when the Russian government has the feedback, is ready to heed to the needs of the people. When the Russian government is harassing the people, is using the human resources for their own objectives, it leads to the revolution and the civil war, because the people does not have any choice. So our choice is to avoid the victims, to have the minimum number of victims, to pass through the stage as quick as possible and as painful as possible. That's why we are training people for that, so that there wouldn't be any chaotic situations. Everything that is happening on the territory of Russia during the civil war would be controllable, and innocent people would not suffer, so that it would be possible to get rid of heads of terrorist organizations in order to stop the bloodshed, so that we can stop the phase of the civil war that will happen. Everything that is happening is to train our supporters to go through the chaos stage without chaos, or with the minimum number of casualties among innocent people.
Well, it seems like you've already started a very important part of the process. It might take time, as all these issues do. We have seen, again in Iran, the parallel of resistance movements take part over the course of many years. But at the same time, it sounds to me like there's more integration among the ethnic opposition that you're discussing, and there's also possibility of learning from other people's both mistakes and triumphs. So hopefully your message will get through, and will get more attention, because I think the world needs to know a lot more about different groups, different perspectives, different histories and cultures that have been erased from the Russian history curriculum around the world. And I think this educational part and this sort of outreach is as important as any as the political and military activity on the ground. And I hope I hope in the future we'll be back with different members of this movement to talk more about what is happening, about the progress, and or about highlighting different histories and different parts of the movement. Thank you so much for joining us today, and thanks to everyone who's been watching this program. We'll be back, of course, as always, next Tuesday night at 9 p.m. on the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio.